The sun beat down mercilessly on the wide stretch of land that once thrived under the care of Samuel, a poor but hard-working rancher. His ranch had not always been this silent, nor his barns this empty. Years back, the pasture had been green, cattle had roamed freely, and the ranch had carried the smell of hay, leather, and fresh bread from his late mother's kitchen. But now, the soil cracked under the weight of drought, and the once lively fields had become a dusty reminder of better times. Samuel had inherited the ranch from his father, a stern man who had built it with sweat and iron will. It was not the largest ranch in the territory, but it had been enough to feed the family and keep pride in their name. Yet Samuel's life had been far harsher. His father's passing left debts unpaid, and a storm 2 winters ago had wiped out half the cattle herd. What little remained had been sold to cover taxes, leaving Samuel with a few chickens, an old mule, and more burdens than one man should bear. Each morning, he rose before dawn, walking the land in silence, his boots kicking up dust as he checked fences that no longer held cattle. He patched roofs that sheltered nothing but emptiness. It was the kind of life that wore a man thin, not just in body but in spirit. The neighbors pitied him, though few said it aloud. They whispered that Samuel had been dealt a cruel hand by fate. Some even said he ought to sell the land and move on, for the earth here had turned its back on him. But Samuel was stubborn as the rocks that lined the hills. The only creature he still trusted to give him hope was his mule, Daisy, who followed him faithfully as if she too carried the weight of his worries. Yet Daisy could not plow the fields alone, nor feed a man who had gone too long on bread crusts and beans. Samuel knew the truth. Without cattle, a rancher was nothing. The land might bear his name, but without livestock, it was no more than dirt and fences. At night, Samuel often sat by the dying embers of his fire, staring into the flames with weary eyes. He would remember his father's words. A man's worth is tied to the land he tends and the beasts he raises. Lose one and you'll struggle. Lose both and you'll break. Samuel wondered if he was already broken. Hunger pressed harder with each passing day. The general storekeeper, Mr. Brown, had stopped extending credit, muttering that Samuel's word wasn't enough anymore. The sheriff, who once tipped his hat kindly, now avoided his gaze. Even the local preacher, who usually had a word of encouragement for every soul, offered only silent prayers when Samuel passed. Poverty was not just a lack of food or money. It was a shadow that drove friends away and left a man standing alone against the wind. And so Samuel found himself facing a truth that gnawed at his pride. He needed help. He needed cattle, even just one, to begin again. But where could a man with nothing find the means to start over? It was in this fragile state, teetering between despair and determination, that Samuel's path would take an unexpected turn. A stranger would soon appear with a bargain, an offer that no desperate rancher could refuse. But Samuel had yet to learn that sometimes salvation carried a price heavier than hunger. It was a Wednesday morning when Samuel walked into town with nothing more than a few eggs in his sack and the dust of his ranch clinging to his boots. He had hoped to trade the eggs for flour or salt, though he knew the storekeeper's patience had worn thin. The small frontier town buzzed faintly that day, wagons rattling along the main road, children chasing one another in the heat, and merchants calling out their wares. To Samuel, it all felt distant, as if he were an outsider drifting through a world that had moved on without him. Inside Brown's general store, Samuel placed his eggs on the counter. Mr. Brown, a stout man with a graying beard, raised an eyebrow. "Samuel," he said, scratching his chin, "I can give you half a sack of flour for these, but after this I reckon you'll need coin if you want more." "Eggs and promises won't keep my shelves filled," Samuel nodded silently. Pride would not let him beg, though hunger had already pushed him close to it. He picked up the flour, his shoulders heavy with shame. As he turned to leave, a voice from the corner stopped him. "You're Samuel the rancher?" The voice belonged to a man Samuel had never seen before. Tall, dressed in fine clothes, too polished for this dusty town. His hat was tilted low, his boots spotless, and his eyes sharp with the glint of business. He stepped forward, smiling in a way that felt both kind and calculating. "That's right," Samuel replied cautiously. "And you are?" Name's Mr. Turner. I deal in livestock. And arrangements? His words rolled smoothly, practiced like a salesman's pitch. I hear you've fallen on hard times. A man in your position needs cattle, at least one to start. Lucky for you, I've got a cow I'm willing to part with. Samuel's heart quickened. A cow was exactly what he needed, a chance to breed, to milk, to build something again. But there was a catch in Mr. Turner's tone, and Samuel knew better than to believe in gifts from strangers. And what would this cow cost me? He asked slowly. Mr. Turner's smile widened, though his eyes stayed cold. Not money. You don't have that. What I want is simpler. There's a woman, newly arrived in these parts. Strong, healthy, but alone. Folks say she needs a husband, someone who will give her a name and a roof. You marry her, and the cow is yours. The words struck Samuel harder than he expected. Marriage? To a stranger? He studied Mr. Turner's face, searching for the trick. And why, Samuel asked carefully, would a man like you care about who she marries? Turner's expression darkened just for a flicker. Let's just say she ain't from around here. She needs a place, a husband, someone to keep questions away. You'll get the cow, she'll get security. Fair trade, wouldn't you agree? Samuel stood silent, his flour sack growing heavy in his hand. He thought of his barren ranch, of nights spent staring into dying embers, of the weight of failure pressing down like a noose. One cow could mean survival, but a wife? A stranger with no history, no kin, no love? It was a bargain that tied his hunger to a mystery. Think on it, Mr. Turner said, clapping Samuel's shoulder as though they were already friends. But don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't wait around. As Samuel walked back to his ranch, dust swirling at his heels, the offer haunted him. The cow was a lifeline, yet the marriage felt like chains he could not see. Still, a starving man cannot afford to choose comfort over survival. And Samuel, desperate, weary, and bound by pride, already knew that his answer was leaning toward yes. 2 days after Mr. Turner's proposal, Samuel found himself standing in the small wooden church at the edge of town. The building smelled faintly of pine resin and candle wax, its pews worn smooth by years of prayers. Outside, the sky threatened rain, though the dry land had long forgotten the taste of it. Samuel had said yes. He told himself it was for the cow, for survival, for the land that bore his father's name. But deep down, he knew it was also desperation, the kind that makes a man leap at anything that resembles hope. The bride arrived quietly, escorted by Mr. Turner. She was cloaked in a dark shawl despite the heat, her face half hidden by a thin veil. Only her eyes showed, and they were dark as river stones, unreadable. Samuel's stomach knotted as he watched her move with steady, deliberate steps down the aisle. Not hurried, not shy, just controlled. The preacher, Reverend Miles, cleared his throat and glanced at Samuel. His hesitation was plain, but he said nothing. He opened his Bible, and the words of the ceremony rolled out, practiced and tired. There were no flowers, no music, no smiling neighbors to clap the groom on the back. Just the rancher, the veiled woman, the preacher, and Mr. Turner, who stood in the shadows like a man watching a deal close. When it came time for vows, Samuel spoke his line with a voice that trembled more from uncertainty than emotion. The woman's response was softer, barely more than a whisper, yet it carried clear enough for all to hear. I do. And just like that, Samuel was no longer a poor bachelor, but a husband bound to a woman whose name he barely knew. She was introduced only as Clara, nothing more. No family, no past, no explanations. A stranger now tied to his life as firmly as a brand seared onto cattle hide. After the ceremony, Mr. Turner wasted no time. He led Samuel outside, where a sturdy brown cow stood tethered to a post. The sight nearly broke Samuel, so much promise in one creature, so much chance to rebuild. Turner handed him the rope with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. A deal's a deal. Take good care of her. Both of them. Samuel nodded, though unease twisted in his chest. He turned back to see Clara standing in the doorway of the church, veil still hiding her face, hands folded as if she were waiting for a judgment. The ride back to the ranch was a strange procession, Samuel leading the cow, Clara following silently a few paces behind. She never complained, never stumbled, never asked questions. Samuel tried speaking once or twice, simple words about the land, the weather, but she gave no reply, only slight nods. Her silence wrapped around him like a heavy blanket, making the distance between them feel wider than the plains. When they reached the ranch, Samuel paused, unsure of what to say or do. His house, though humble, was all he had left of family and pride. He gestured awkwardly toward the door. "It ain't much, but it's home. You can settle in." Clara stepped inside without a word. She moved with an odd grace, as though she had lived in stranger places than this. She took in the bare furniture, the cracked walls, the patched floor, and showed no disappointment. Only those unreadable eyes gave anything away, and even then Samuel couldn't tell if it was sorrow, relief, or something darker. That night, as Samuel sat outside under the starlight, Daisy the mule braying softly nearby, he felt the weight of the day press down on him. He had a cow, a wife, and a ranch that might yet breathe again. But something gnawed at him. Clara was no ordinary woman. He could feel it in the silence, in the way Turner had looked at her, in the way she carried secrets like shadows stitched into her veil. The days after the wedding moved strangely for Samuel, as though he were walking through a dream that did not belong to him. There had been no laughter, no music, no celebration to mark his new life. Only the soft, restrained "I do" from Clara and the satisfied smirk on Mr. Turner's face when he handed over the cow. Tradition in the territory dictated that a wedding was meant to bind not only man and wife but also community. Neighbors would bring pies, children would scatter wildflowers, fiddlers would play long into the night while the couple danced for the first time. But for Samuel and Clara, there was none of that. Instead, their wedding feast had been a stale loaf of bread and boiled beans, eaten quietly in the dim light of Samuel's cabin. Clara sat across from him at the rough wooden table, her veil now removed. Samuel stole glances when he thought she would not notice. She was not plain, as the townsfolk had whispered, nor was she the grotesque figure gossip had painted. Her features were soft yet firm, high cheekbones, a mouth that seemed trained never to smile, and those eyes dark and watchful. She did not look like a woman beaten down by life. She looked like a woman who knew how to keep herself hidden. Samuel cleared his throat once or twice, searching for words to fill the silence. "You'll find things simple here," he said at last. "House ain't much, but it's solid. Land's dry, but with the cow, maybe we'll manage." Clara only nodded, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She ate little, and when she did, it was with slow, precise movements, like someone taught long ago to never waste or rush. That first night, Samuel lay awake on his narrow bed, listening. Clara had taken the small room near the back, the door closing with a soft thud. No words were exchanged, no warmth passed between them. Samuel stared at the cracked ceiling, wondering what kind of marriage began with locked doors and silence. He told himself it was only nerves. She was a stranger after all, and perhaps time would open her up. But unease lingered like a splinter beneath his skin. The next morning, Clara was already awake, standing outside with the cow. She moved with practiced care, milking as though she had done it all her life. The sight startled Samuel. He had not expected her to work without being asked. She carried the pail inside and set it on the counter. Still no words, just a nod. In town, whispers had already begun to spread. People said the wedding had been too quiet, too sudden. Some claimed Clara was hiding from the law. Others insisted she was cursed. Samuel, walking past the saloon that day, heard two men laughing over their drinks. "Poor fool married her for a cow," one said. "Reckon the cow's worth more than the bride," the other replied. Their laughter followed Samuel like thorns. He clenched his jaw and kept walking, but inside he burned with shame and anger. Back at the ranch, Clara carried on as if the gossip did not touch her. She swept the floors, boiled water, mended a tear in Samuel's only decent shirt. She worked quietly, efficiently, never asking for thanks. It should have comforted Samuel, but instead it unsettled him more. Who was she? This woman who moved like a ghost through his home, binding herself to his life yet keeping herself apart. On the third night, as he approached her room, Samuel noticed again that the door was closed and latched. He stood there for a long moment, his hand hovering near the knob before stepping away. A locked door was no accident. The ceremony had been silent, the house was silent, and the marriage itself seemed bound in silence. Samuel began to fear that he had not just married a stranger, he had married a mystery. And mysteries, he knew from hard experience, rarely brought peace. It didn't take long for the town to notice Samuel's new bride. In places like Dry Creek, nothing stayed secret for long. Not a new horse, not a late-night fight at the saloon, and certainly not a marriage arranged in whispers with no kin to vouch for the bride. The first whispers came from the women who lingered outside the general store. They pretended to busy themselves with baskets and bolts of fabric, but their voices carried down the street. "She's too quiet," one muttered. "Too clean, too polished for ranch life," another replied. "A woman with no family don't end up here unless she's running from something." Samuel heard them once when he passed by with flour on his shoulder. He kept his eyes forward, but their words stuck like burrs in his mind. The men in the saloon weren't much better. They made jokes at his expense, mocking his desperation, calling Clara the cow wife, suggesting Samuel had traded his pride for livestock. Each laugh cut Samuel deeper than he cared to admit. Poverty was hard enough to swallow, but being the butt of every joke in town made it bitterer still. Even Reverend Miles, who had performed the ceremony with reluctance, seemed uneasy. He stopped Samuel after Sunday service, his voice low and uncertain. "Son," he said, "you know nothing about that woman. It ain't my place to judge, but I'd keep my eyes open if I were you. God teaches us to love, but he also warns us about wolves in sheep's clothing." Samuel only nodded, too proud to admit that doubt had already started gnawing at him. Back at the ranch, Clara remained an enigma. She worked hard, cooking simple meals, patching worn clothes, tending to the cow as though it were the finest animal in the territory. Samuel couldn't fault her effort, but she spoke so little it unsettled him. When he asked about her past, she would either change the subject or offer the vaguest of answers. "Where are you from?" He tried one evening, leaning back in his chair. "East," she said softly, not meeting his eyes. "Do you have family?" "They're gone." "Gone where?" A long pause. Then, "Just gone." It was like trying to dig water from stone. At night, the locked door remained a barrier between them. Samuel wrestled with it in his mind. Was it modesty, fear, or something darker? He told himself that in time, trust would grow and the door would open. Yet each evening he stood outside that room, hearing only silence from within. The unease in his chest deepened. One evening, while he was in town to buy salt, Mr. Turner reappeared. The man leaned against the rail outside the store, his polished boots catching the last light of day. "How's married life treating you?" Turner asked, his grin sly. Samuel stiffened. "It's fine." "Fine, eh?" Strange word for a man whose wife don't speak and don't share his bed. Turner's voice dropped lower. "Don't you wonder who she really is? What she's hiding?" Samuel's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Turner's words were poison, but they echoed too close to his own secret fears. By the time Samuel made the long ride back to the ranch, the whispers of the town were louder than ever in his head. Every look Clara gave, every silence she kept felt loaded with hidden meaning. Yet when he saw her standing in the yard, feeding the cow with calm, steady hands, he faltered. She didn't look like danger. She looked lonely. Still, Samuel knew one thing for certain. Gossip had a way of turning into fire, and fire, once started, consumed everything. And in Dry Creek, folks were piling kindling fast. The whispers of the town followed Samuel home like wolves nipping at his heels. He tried to push them aside, telling himself they were just gossip born of boredom, but every look Clara gave him, or didn't give him, added weight to the doubts. And that night, when the prairie wind rattled the shutters and the lamp burned low, his unease reached its peak. It was their wedding night. A time when most husbands and wives would share warmth, laughter, maybe even the fragile beginnings of love. But for Samuel, it became something else entirely. He had sat at the table long after supper, staring at the flickering flame of the lantern while Clara washed the dishes. Her movements were steady, graceful, her silence unbroken except for the faint clatter of tin against wood. He cleared his throat once, twice, searching for words. Finally, he said, "It's been near a week since we married. You've kept your room locked every night. You mean to tell me you'll keep on like that?" Clara did not answer right away. She dried her hands, set the rag aside, and looked at him. Her eyes, dark, steady, unreadable, met his with a force that unsettled him more than any spoken word. "Some doors," she said quietly, "are locked for good reason." Samuel's brow furrowed. "And what reason's that if I'm your husband?" But Clara only turned away, walking to the small room at the back of the cabin. The door closed with a soft click, then the unmistakable scrape of a bolt sliding into place. Samuel sat frozen, the silence pressing against him like a weight. Anger, shame, and confusion churned inside him. He rose to his feet, paced the floor, then finally strode to her door. His hand hovered over the knob. He tried once, twisting it gently, but it would not move. The bolt held firm. "Clara," he said through the wood, his voice rough, "I ain't a cruel man, but I won't be made a fool either. You owe me truth." There was no reply. Only silence, heavy and final. Samuel leaned his forehead against the door, the wood cool against his skin. A bitter laugh escaped his throat. Here he was, a man who had given up his pride, tied his life to a stranger, all for the sake of one cow, and now, even in his own home, he was locked out. The night stretched long. Samuel sat by the dying fire, staring into the embers, replaying every detail of Clara's behavior. Her silence, her careful work, her watchful eyes, her refusal to speak of her past. The townsfolk's whispers clawed at him. "She's cursed. She's dangerous. She's hiding something." Sleep never came. Instead, Samuel watched the shadows crawl across the cabin walls until dawn painted the sky gray. When he finally stepped outside, he found Clara already at work, feeding the cow, her face calm and expressionless, as if nothing had happened. She looked up at him once, then went back to her task without a word. Samuel's fists clenched at his sides. "You can keep your secrets," he muttered under his breath. But secrets got a way of finding light. As the sun rose over the barren fields, Samuel realized two things. He had married a woman who would not let him past a locked door, and whatever truth lay behind it, he was no longer sure if he wanted to know. The days that followed were some of the strangest Samuel had ever lived. Clara worked beside him like a shadow, silent, efficient, steady. She rose before dawn, tended to the cow, swept the floors, and kept the cabin in better order than it had ever been. On the surface, she was the very picture of a dutiful wife. But the silence, the locked door each night, the guarded eyes, the answers that never seemed to come, gnawed at him like a coyote worrying a bone. At first, Samuel tried to ignore it. He told himself she simply needed time. But time came and went, and the wall between them never fell. The more he tried to speak with her, the more he realized how little he knew. One afternoon, as the sun baked the land and cicadas sang their endless song, Samuel found himself watching Clara from the porch. She moved through the yard with purpose, gathering herbs she'd planted behind the cabin. Strange ones, too, not the usual kitchen herbs. Some he didn't even recognize. She bundled them with a precision that unsettled him. Finally, he asked, "Where'd you learn all that?" Clara looked up briefly. "From my mother." Samuel leaned against the porch post, squinting at her. "And where's she now?" Clara's hands stilled. She hesitated, then said softly, "Gone. Like the rest of them." The answer was too neat, too quick, and Samuel's suspicions only deepened. He opened his mouth to press further, but Clara turned her back, gathering the last of the herbs with finality. Conversation, as always, was over before it had begun. That night, Samuel made up his mind. He would know what she was hiding. After she slipped into her room and bolted the door, Samuel waited until the house was still. Then, barefoot, he crept down the hallway. He leaned close, ear pressed to the wood. At first he heard nothing but silence. Then, faint, almost swallowed by the walls, a whisper. Words he could not make out. A rhythm, like prayer or chant. His chest tightened. Clara wasn't sleeping behind that door. She was speaking to someone, or something else. A chill ran through him. He stepped back, heart pounding. For the first time, he wondered if the townsfolk's gossip held truth. Was she cursed? Was she running from something worse than the law? The next morning, Clara emerged as if nothing had happened. She handed Samuel a cup of milk, eyes calm, movements steady. But Samuel's hand trembled when he took it. He looked at her, really looked at her, and the mystery around her seemed heavier than ever. His unease grew when he went into town that week. Whispers followed him from store to saloon. She keeps to herself too much. Strange hours, strange ways. Mark my words, that woman ain't right. One old woman muttered. I seen her at night by the river, talking low, like she was calling to spirits. Samuel tried to shake it off, but doubt clung like dust to his boots. When he returned home, Clara was waiting on the porch, her dark eyes fixed on him. For a heartbeat, he felt as though she knew everything. The whispers, his spying at her door, the questions gnawing at him. Something wrong? She asked quietly, her voice steady. Samuel forced a rough laugh. No, nothing. But inside he knew it was a lie. Everything was wrong. The mystery of Clara was growing like a storm on the horizon, silent, gathering strength, waiting to break, and Samuel, caught between fear and need, could do nothing but wait for the thunder. The storm Samuel had sensed finally broke one restless night. The prairie was black under a moonless sky, the wind carrying with it the sharp scent of rain. Samuel sat awake by the hearth, staring into the embers. Sleep had abandoned him days ago. Clara's silence, her locked door, the whispers in town, they had coiled around his mind like a rattlesnake, hissing and tight. When the wind howled louder, Samuel rose, restless, and stepped outside. That's when he saw it, the faint glow of a lantern near the barn. His first thought was rustlers. He reached for his rifle, heart hammering, and crept closer. But it wasn't rustlers. It was Clara. She stood near the cow, the lantern set low, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. And she wasn't alone. 3 figures lingered at the edge of the barn, shadowed, rough-looking men with eyes sharp and voices hushed. Samuel ducked behind a fence post, straining to hear. One of the men hissed, "You can't keep this up forever." "They'll find you." Clara's voice, quiet but firm, answered, "Not here. Not while I keep the doors closed. He mustn't know." The words hit Samuel like a hammer. She was speaking of him. The tallest man stepped forward, his tone sharper. "You think a locked door will keep them out? They'll come, Clara. And when they do, he'll pay the price too." Clara's eyes flashed in the lantern light. "Then let them come for me, not for him." Samuel's breath caught in his throat. He pressed harder against the fence, his rifle cold in his hands. The men muttered among themselves, then melted back into the shadows, leaving Clara standing alone with the lantern. She turned, her face pale and drawn, as though carrying a burden far heavier than Samuel had guessed. When she finally returned to the cabin, Samuel slipped inside before her, his mind a whirlwind. Later that night, he stood by her door again, unable to hold back. "Clara," he said firmly, "open it." For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, the bolt scraped back. Clara opened the door just enough for him to see her face in the dim glow of a candle. "You heard?" she said quietly. Samuel's throat felt dry. "Who were they?" Her eyes dropped, and for the first time he saw not defiance, but sorrow. "Men who once rode with my kin, outlaws, raiders. I left them behind. I thought I could start over, but they've found me again." Samuel's grip tightened on the rifle in his hand. "And Turner? He knew?" She nodded faintly. "He brought me here. Not out of kindness, out of convenience. He thought if I had a husband, it'd hide me better. But it won't. They'll come, Samuel. And when they do, I'll be the one they want, not you." The truth fell heavy between them. Clara had not locked her door out of cruelty or coldness. She had locked it to keep her past sealed away, to keep Samuel from being dragged into a danger he didn't deserve. Samuel stared at her, anger and confusion battling inside him. He wanted to shout, to demand why she hadn't trusted him, why she'd kept him blind. But another part of him, the part that saw the exhaustion in her eyes, kept him quiet. Finally, he lowered the rifle. "Secrets won't save you, Clara, and they sure as hell won't save me. If they're coming, then we face it together." For the first time since they'd wed, Clara's expression cracked. The smallest flicker of something, relief, maybe even trust, passed through her eyes, and Samuel, though still burdened with doubt, realized the mystery had become something more. It was no longer just about the cow or pride or survival. It was about standing with the stranger he had married, even if her shadows threatened to swallow them both. In a small village, a cat named Whiskers discovered a magic fish in a pond. The fish promised 3 wishes in exchange for its freedom. Whiskers wished for endless fish, a cozy bed, and a bell that rang softly. The fish granted all 3 wishes and swam away, leaving Whiskers content and purring in the sun. The truth hung between them like the crackle of thunder before a storm. Clara's past was no longer a ghost Samuel could ignore. It was flesh, blood, and danger stalking the edges of his ranch. And now, whether he liked it or not, her fight had become his. The following days were tense, each hour stretched thin. Clara spoke a little more now, but only in fragments. She told him of nights spent on the run, of raids carried out by men who lived by the gun, of fires and blood spilled on the frontier. Her kin had been ruthless, but Clara had walked away, determined to bury that life. "I thought marriage would cover my trail," she confessed once, her voice shaking. "I thought if I tied myself to a good man, they'd leave me be." Samuel didn't know whether to feel honored or betrayed. She had chosen him, not for love, not even for companionship, but as a shield. Yet as he watched her mend his coat by lamplight, or tend to the cow with steady hands, he realized something. She wasn't just hiding behind him. She was fighting to protect him too. Still, protection came at a cost. One evening, Samuel found boot prints by the river, fresh in the mud. Not his, not Clara's. He followed them a short way, rifle in hand, until they vanished into the brush. That night, Clara admitted the truth. The men had been watching, waiting, testing. "They'll come for me," she said, her eyes burning with certainty. "And if you stand in their way, they'll kill you too." Samuel stared at her, anger and pride surging. "So what do you want me to do? Run? Leave my land, my father's name, my blood in this soil?" Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. "I want you to live." Her words cut him sharp and deep. She would rather sacrifice herself than see him fall. But Samuel's heart, stubborn as the land he tended, could not accept that. The test came sooner than either of them expected. It was near midnight when the sound of horses shattered the quiet. Samuel jolted upright from his chair by the fire, rifle in hand. Clara was already awake, standing at the window, her face pale in the moonlight. Outside, torches bobbed like fireflies across the field, and the distant shouts of men carried on the wind. "They've come," Clara whispered. Samuel's pulse thundered. His first instinct was to send her away, to hide her in the cellar or the woods. But Clara shook her head before he even spoke. "No hiding. If I run, they'll burn this place to the ground. You'll lose everything." He gritted his teeth, torn in two. He could let her go, cut her loose to save himself and the ranch. That was what pride screamed at him. But his heart, the same heart that had sat in silence with her, that had watched her carry burdens no one else could see, demanded something else. He tightened his grip on the rifle. "Then we stand." Clara's eyes widened just slightly. For the first time since they'd wed, she reached out and took his hand. Her fingers trembled, but her voice was steady. "Together, then." The glow of torches drew closer, shadows stretching long against the prairie. Samuel felt the weight of choice settle heavy on his shoulders. This was no longer about a cow or a deal struck in desperation. It was about trust, about whether he truly believed the woman who had locked her door, kept her secrets, and now stood ready to fight by his side. And as the first horseman crested the hill, torchlight blazing, Samuel knew the test of trust had begun. The night blazed with firelight as the riders surrounded the ranch. Their torches flickered against the dark sky, casting jagged shadows across the barn and fields. Samuel stood on the porch, rifle raised, his heart pounding steady as a war drum. Beside him, Clara lifted the lantern, her face pale but resolute. The leader of the gang, a scarred man with a crooked grin, reined his horse forward. His voice carried sharp across the wind. "Clara! You think you can run from blood? You think some fool rancher can save you?" Clara's grip tightened on Samuel's hand, but she stepped forward. "I'm not running anymore. I left your fire and steel behind. You want me, here I am. But leave him out of it." The men laughed, cruel and mocking. "That's not how it works. He chose to stand with you. He dies with you." Samuel felt the burn of fear, but it hardened into something stronger, defiance. He raised his rifle, the barrel gleaming in torchlight. "You'll set foot on this land over my body," he said, his voice low and steady. A tense silence followed, broken only by the restless snorts of the horses. Then the scarred man snarled and kicked his mount forward, signaling the attack. The first shot cracked the night like thunder. Samuel fired true, dropping one rider from his horse. Chaos erupted. Gunfire split the dark. Torches flared. Horses screamed. Samuel reloaded, his hands steady though his lungs burned with smoke and fear. Clara darted between the shadows, hurling lantern oil to douse the torches and blind their attackers. She moved with a sharpness Samuel hadn't seen before, quick, fierce, unyielding. At one point, a rider broke through toward the barn, aiming to torch it. Clara seized Samuel's spare pistol, her hands trembling but her aim true. The shot rang out and the man toppled, his torch sputtering in the mud. Samuel turned, stunned. Clara met his gaze, her jaw set. "I won't let them take everything from you," she said. The fight raged on, but Samuel realized something. These weren't invincible raiders. They were flesh and bone, and they hadn't counted on resistance. With Clara at his side, they drove the outlaws back, one by one. At last, the scarred leader found himself alone, his men scattered or fallen. He glared at Clara, fury in his eyes. "You'll never be rid of us. Blood always finds you." Clara stepped forward, her voice steady. "Then let it find me standing." Samuel raised his rifle again, but the man snarled, spat into the dirt, and spurred his horse into the darkness. The night fell quiet, the only sound the crackle of dying torches and the distant roll of thunder. For a long moment, Samuel and Clara stood in silence, the weight of battle pressing down. Then Samuel lowered his rifle and turned to her. She was exhausted, her face streaked with soot. But her eyes were alive, fierce, shining with something that wasn't fear anymore. "You should have told me," Samuel said softly. "I thought I was protecting you," she whispered. He shook his head, stepping closer. "Protection isn't locking doors. It's opening them. It's standing together." Her breath caught, and then slowly she nodded. For the first time since their wedding, she let the walls fall, her hand finding his not out of necessity, but out of choice. Dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and rose. The ranch was scarred but still standing. The cow grazed peacefully by the fence, unaware of the battle fought to protect her new home. Samuel looked out over his land, battered yet unbroken, and then at the woman beside him, no longer a stranger, no longer a secret. They had faced fire, bullets, and shadows of the past. And in that trial by storm, they had forged something stronger than any bargain. Trust. The rancher who had married for a cow had gained something far greater. A partner. A beginning. A chance at a life built not on desperation but on courage and love.